Judge Patricia Monroe wasn't just traveling through Phoenix Sky Harbor Airport that evening after a long judicial conference. But when airport police questioned her presence in the terminal, their courthouse encounter 48 hours later would become the most humbling moment in law enforcement history. Judge Patricia Monroe moved through the busy corridors of Phoenix Sky Harbor International Airport with the measured dignity of someone who had spent 23 years upholding constitutional principles and ensuring equal justice under law as one of the most respected federal judges in the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals, where her judicial opinions had shaped constitutional interpretation and civil rights jurisprudence that protected fundamental freedoms for millions of Americans. At 54 years old, she carried herself with quiet authority that comes from earning a Juris Doctor from Harvard Law School with highest honors, serving as a federal prosecutor, and developing expertise in constitutional law that had qualified her for appointment to the federal bench by the President after confirmation by the United States Senate. Her credentials included authoring over 400 published judicial opinions, delivering lectures on constitutional law at prestigious law schools, and contributing to legal scholarship in Harvard Law Review and Yale Law Journal that established her as a leading authority on federal criminal procedure and constitutional interpretation. Today's late flight to Los Angeles was returning her from the annual Federal Judicial Conference in Denver, where she had participated in discussions about judicial ethics and constitutional interpretation with fellow federal judges, though she was traveling in casual civilian attire rather than the judicial robes that typically identified her as one of the nation's most senior federal judges with lifetime tenure and constitutional authority. Her understated navy blazer reflected her preference for maintaining personal privacy during travel, allowing her to move through public spaces without formal recognition. Though her analytical mindset kept her constantly aware of constitutional issues and civil rights concerns in everyday interactions between citizens and government officials. Airport Security Officer Marcus Thompson, a veteran employee with 6 years of law enforcement experience who had developed assumptions about criminal behavior based on racial profiling rather than actual evidence, observed Patricia's quiet concentration without recognizing the judicial authority that characterized someone who regularly made decisions affecting federal law enforcement and constitutional rights. Without any reasonable suspicion or probable cause, Officer Thompson approached Patricia with aggressive questioning that violated basic Fourth Amendment protection against unreasonable searches and seizures, demonstrating racial profiling that had become embedded in airport security procedures despite federal guidelines requiring individualized suspicion based on specific behavior rather than demographic characteristics. "Ma'am, I need to see identification and ask about your activities in this airport," Thompson demanded with authority and intimidation tactics that escalated a routine travel situation into unconstitutional investigative detention. "You've been observed in the terminal for an extended period, and we need to verify your legitimate business and travel purposes." Patricia immediately recognized the constitutional violations and racial profiling that characterized Thompson's approach. Understanding from her experience as a federal judge that his techniques lacked reasonable suspicion required by the Fourth Amendment and represented discriminatory law enforcement practices that federal courts had repeatedly found unconstitutional. "Officer, I'm simply waiting for my delayed flight to Los Angeles," she replied with calm professionalism and constitutional awareness. "What specific behavior have you observed that would constitute reasonable suspicion of criminal activity under Terry v. Ohio and subsequent Fourth Amendment precedent?" Thompson responded to Patricia's constitutional knowledge with increased suspicion and law enforcement aggression, interpreting her familiarity with legal standards as evidence of criminal sophistication rather than recognizing legal education and professional expertise. "Lady, "Don't try to lecture me about police procedures," he replied with hostility and arrogance that demonstrated complete ignorance of constitutional requirements. "I'm asking the questions here, and I need you to cooperate with this security investigation, or we'll escalate this situation to additional law enforcement personnel." Patricia observed Thompson's escalating constitutional violations with professional concern and judicial awareness of civil rights problems, understanding that his investigative techniques violated clearly established federal law and demonstrated discriminatory policing that required immediate constitutional intervention. As Thompson's detention continued without constitutional justification, additional airport security personnel arrived to support what had become violation of Patricia's Fourth Amendment rights through racial profiling and discriminatory law enforcement practices that lacked reasonable suspicion of criminal activity, creating an increasingly serious constitutional crisis that would result in federal civil rights litigation and comprehensive reform of airport security procedures. "We're going to need you to come with us for additional questioning and security screening," announced Supervisor Janet Rodriguez as she joined Thompson's unconstitutional investigation with additional law enforcement personnel prepared to escalate the situation into custodial arrest without probable cause. "Your behavior and responses have raised security concerns that require further investigation and verification of your identity and travel purposes." Patricia recognized the dangerous escalation of constitutional violations and nature of racial profiling, understanding from her judicial experience that the situation represented discriminatory law enforcement practices that federal courts had found violated equal protection guarantees and due process requirements under the Fifth and 14th Amendments. "I am explicitly invoking my Fifth Amendment right to remain silent and my Sixth Amendment right to counsel," she stated with judicial authority and constitutional precision. "This investigative detention lacks reasonable suspicion, and any further escalation will constitute false imprisonment and deprivation of rights under color of law in violation of 42 U.S.C. Section 1983. Rodriguez interpreted Patricia's constitutional knowledge and legal assertions as further evidence of suspicious behavior rather than recognizing legal education and professional expertise. "Ma'am, your knowledge of legal procedures is concerning and suggests possible criminal sophistication," Rodriguez replied with law enforcement logic that demonstrated profound ignorance of constitutional rights. More airport personnel and passengers began witnessing the developing constitutional crisis, as Patricia's lawful behavior was subjected to increasingly aggressive law enforcement scrutiny that lacked any legal justification or reasonable suspicion of criminal activity, creating a public spectacle of racial profiling and discriminatory policing that violated clearly established constitutional principles. As the unconstitutional detention continued to escalate, Dr. Robert Chen, a civil rights attorney who had been observing the situation with growing alarm, approached the law enforcement encounter with constitutional expertise and immediate recognition that Patricia's civil rights were being violated through police practices that clearly exceeded constitutional boundaries. "Officers, I'm an attorney, and I need to inform you that this investigative detention appears to lack the reasonable suspicion required by the Fourth Amendment," Chen announced with professional authority, while observing the constitutional violations occurring in the public airport terminal. "This passenger has not exhibited any behavior that would constitute reasonable suspicion of criminal activity, and continued detention without constitutional justification could result in significant civil rights liability under federal law." Thompson and Rodriguez responded to Chen's constitutional intervention with defensive law enforcement posturing and increased resistance to legal oversight, apparently prioritizing their authority over constitutional requirements and proper investigative procedures. "Sir, this is a security investigation, that doesn't require civilian legal advice, Thompson replied with hostility and law enforcement arrogance that demonstrated his fundamental misunderstanding of constitutional limits on police authority. We're conducting appropriate security procedures, and interference with our investigation could result in obstruction charges. Patricia observed the developing constitutional crisis with judicial concern and professional awareness of the civil rights violations that Thompson's approach represented. Understanding that his law enforcement techniques violated clearly established federal precedent and demonstrated discriminatory policing that required immediate constitutional intervention. Dr. Chen, I appreciate your constitutional advocacy, she said, with judicial authority and legal expertise. But these officers are determined to pursue unconstitutional investigative techniques despite clear Fourth Amendment limitations and established legal precedent. Chen continued his constitutional intervention while documenting the civil rights violations and discriminatory policing that he was witnessing, understanding that the situation represented exactly the type of racial profiling and unconstitutional law enforcement practices that required immediate legal intervention and subsequent federal civil rights litigation. Despite the complete absence of probable cause or any evidence of criminal activity, Thompson and Rodriguez escalated their constitutional violations by placing Patricia under custodial arrest through systematic racial profiling and discriminatory law enforcement practices that violated clearly established federal precedent and constitutional requirements for criminal procedure, creating a federal civil rights case that would ultimately result in comprehensive reform of airport security procedures and significant financial liability. You're under arrest for suspicious behavior and failure to cooperate with security procedures, Rodriguez announced, while applying handcuffs in a public display of discriminatory policing that violated Patricia's constitutional rights and demonstrated the systematic nature of racial profiling in airport law enforcement operations throughout the security system. You have the right to remain silent, though your legal knowledge suggests possible criminal background that requires further investigation. Patricia maintained her judicial composure and constitutional awareness despite the obvious civil rights violations and discriminatory treatment she was experiencing, understanding that the situation represented exactly the type of systematic unconstitutional policing that federal courts existed to remedy through civil rights litigation and constitutional enforcement mechanisms. This arrest lacks probable cause and violates clearly established Fourth Amendment precedent, she stated with judicial authority and constitutional precision, while being subjected to unlawful custodial detention that would result in significant civil rights liability. I am exercising all constitutional rights and will be pursuing federal civil rights litigation for these violations under 42 U.S.C. Section 1983. Dr. Chen immediately increased his constitutional advocacy and legal documentation of the systematic civil rights violations, understanding that Patricia's custodial arrest represented a clear case of racial profiling and discriminatory policing that violated federal constitutional requirements and established legal precedent governing law enforcement conduct. This arrest is clearly unconstitutional and based on racial profiling rather than probable cause, he announced loudly enough for surrounding passengers and law enforcement personnel to hear and document. Other passengers began expressing outrage and constitutional concern about the obviously discriminatory nature of the arrest, with several individuals using cell phones to record the systematic civil rights violations and discriminatory policing that they were witnessing in the public airport terminal, creating comprehensive documentation of the constitutional violations that would support subsequent federal civil rights litigation. Airport Supervisor Michael Davis, who had been monitoring the situation from the security office, and was becoming increasingly concerned about the constitutional implications and potential civil rights liability of his officers' conduct, finally approached the law enforcement encounter with growing awareness of the systematic constitutional violations that were occurring and the serious federal legal consequences that would result from such discriminatory policing practices. "What is the specific probable cause for this custodial arrest?" Davis asked, with supervisory authority and growing legal concern about the civil rights implications of the situation that his officers had created through racial profiling and discriminatory law enforcement. "We need to ensure that our law enforcement procedures comply with constitutional requirements and established legal precedent governing police conduct." Thompson attempted to justify the constitutional violations and discriminatory arrest with vague references to suspicious behavior and security concerns that clearly failed to meet established legal standards for probable cause or reasonable suspicion under Fourth Amendment jurisprudence and federal criminal procedure requirements. "Officers Thompson and Rodriguez, please explain the specific articulable facts that constitute probable cause for this custodial arrest," Davis demanded with supervisory authority and legal concern about constitutional compliance and civil rights protection. "Our airport security procedures must comply with Fourth Amendment requirements and established constitutional precedent, regardless of any personal assumptions or profiling practices." Rodriguez attempted to justify their discriminatory law enforcement with explanations that revealed the systematic nature of their racial profiling and constitutional ignorance, demonstrating that their police training had failed to provide adequate education about constitutional requirements and proper investigative procedures governed by federal law. Davis immediately understood the constitutional problems and civil rights violations that his officers' explanations revealed, recognizing that their investigative techniques were based on racial profiling rather than legitimate security concerns or constitutional law enforcement principles. "Officers, extended presence in an airport terminal is not criminal behavior, and knowledge of constitutional rights is not evidence of criminal activity," Davis explained with supervisory authority and constitutional awareness that should have guided proper police training. Patricia observed the constitutional education process with judicial satisfaction and professional awareness that proper legal intervention was finally occurring, though she understood that the systematic nature of the civil rights violations required comprehensive reform and federal oversight of airport security procedures to ensure future constitutional compliance and civil rights protection. Understanding the magnitude of the constitutional violations and potential civil rights liability that his officers had created through systematic racial profiling and discriminatory law enforcement, Supervisor Davis immediately ordered Patricia's release from custody and began implementing damage control measures to address the obvious civil rights violations and unconstitutional policing that had occurred during the investigative detention and custodial arrest. "Ma'am, I am immediately ordering your release and sincerely apologizing for the constitutional violations and discriminatory treatment that you have experienced," Davis announced with supervisory authority and growing awareness of the federal civil rights case that his officers' conduct had created through systematic racial profiling and discriminatory policing practices. These law enforcement procedures clearly violated established constitutional standards and proper police training protocols. Patricia accepted her immediate release while maintaining her judicial composure and constitutional awareness of the systematic civil rights problems that the encounter had revealed, understanding that the situation represented exactly the type of discriminatory policing that required comprehensive federal intervention and constitutional reform throughout the law enforcement system. "Supervisor Davis, while I appreciate the immediate resolution, These constitutional violations demonstrate systematic problems with airport security training and civil rights compliance that require comprehensive federal oversight and reform, she replied with judicial authority and obvious constitutional expertise that should have indicated her professional legal background. The discriminatory nature of this encounter indicates institutional problems that extend beyond individual officer conduct. Thompson and Rodriguez observed Patricia's constitutional knowledge and legal expertise with growing awareness that they had made a serious mistake in their law enforcement approach, though they remained largely unaware of the magnitude of their constitutional violations and the professional identity of the individual whose civil rights they had systematically violated through racial profiling and discriminatory policing. Patricia prepared to depart the airport while maintaining her judicial dignity and constitutional awareness. Understanding that the systematic nature of the civil rights violations required appropriate legal follow-up and federal constitutional enforcement that would ensure proper training and compliance with established legal precedent governing police conduct. Officers, your standard procedures violated clearly established constitutional law and demonstrated systematic racial profiling that will require comprehensive reform and federal oversight, she explained with judicial authority and constitutional precision that foreshadowed the legal accountability that would soon follow. Dr. Chen prepared to provide constitutional advocacy and legal support for the federal civil rights litigation that would inevitably result from such clear constitutional violations and discriminatory law enforcement practices. Understanding that the case would serve as an important precedent for airport security reform and civil rights protection throughout the federal system. As Patricia prepared to leave Phoenix Sky Harbor Airport following her unconstitutional detention and discriminatory arrest, she provided Supervisor Davis with her business card and contact information while maintaining her professional dignity and judicial authority. Though she chose not to immediately reveal her federal judicial position in order to allow the constitutional violations to be addressed through proper legal channels rather than immediate positional authority that might overshadow the systematic civil rights problems requiring institutional reform. Supervisor Davis, my attorney will be contacting your office regarding federal civil rights litigation for these constitutional violations, she announced with judicial authority and obvious legal expertise that should have indicated her professional legal background and constitutional knowledge to any competent law enforcement supervisor. This encounter demonstrates systematic problems with airport security training and civil rights compliance that require comprehensive federal oversight and reform. Davis accepted Patricia's contact information with growing concern about the civil rights implications and potential federal litigation that would result from his officer's constitutional violations and discriminatory law enforcement practices. Understanding that the situation had created significant liability for the airport authority and law enforcement agencies involved in the systematic racial profiling. Patricia departed the airport with her judicial composure intact, while beginning the mental preparation for the federal civil rights case that would inevitably result from the systematic constitutional violations and discriminatory policing that she had experienced. Understanding that her unique position as a federal judge would provide particular insight into the constitutional remedies and institutional reforms that were needed to address such systematic civil rights problems in airport security operations. Thompson and Rodriguez completed their shift with growing awareness that they had encountered someone with exceptional constitutional knowledge and legal expertise, though they remained unaware of the federal judicial authority and constitutional position of the individual whose civil rights they had systematically violated through racial profiling and discriminatory law enforcement practices that would soon result in comprehensive institutional reform. Within 48 hours of the airport encounter, Patricia's federal court docket included a routine criminal case involving airport security violations and federal law enforcement procedures, creating the perfect opportunity for the constitutional education and judicial recognition that would transform Thompson and Rodriguez's understanding of federal law, constitutional requirements, and the proper relationship between law enforcement authority and individual civil rights protected by the Constitution. The coincidence of their courthouse appearance would provide immediate constitutional accountability and judicial education about the systematic civil rights violations and discriminatory policing practices that had characterized their airport law enforcement conduct during the unconstitutional detention and arrest that violated clearly established federal precedent and constitutional requirements. 2 days after the airport constitutional crisis, Officers Thompson and Rodriguez arrived at the Federal District Court for the District of Arizona to provide testimony in a routine criminal case involving airport security violations, completely unaware that they were about to encounter the federal judge whose constitutional rights they had systematically violated through racial profiling and discriminatory law enforcement practices during the unconstitutional detention and arrest at Phoenix Sky Harbor Airport that had created significant federal civil rights liability. All rise for the Honorable Judge Patricia Monroe, United States District Judge for the District of Arizona, announced the court bailiff as Patricia entered the federal courtroom, wearing her judicial robes and carrying the constitutional authority of lifetime tenure and federal judicial power that made her one of the most powerful legal officials in the American judicial system, with authority to interpret federal law and protect civil rights. Thompson and Rodriguez stood in stunned recognition as they realized that the woman they had subjected to racial profiling, constitutional violations, and discriminatory arrest was now presiding over their federal court appearance with complete judicial authority to address the systematic civil rights problems and unconstitutional law enforcement practices that had characterized their airport security conduct. Officers Thompson and Rodriguez, Judge Monroe announced with judicial authority and constitutional precision that commanded immediate respect and attention throughout the federal courtroom. I believe we met under different circumstances 2 days ago at Phoenix Sky Harbor Airport, where you conducted an investigative detention and custodial arrest that violated clearly established Fourth Amendment precedent and demonstrated systematic racial profiling that created significant federal civil rights liability. The courtroom atmosphere became immediately tense as all participants understood the extraordinary constitutional irony and judicial accountability that was unfolding, with the officers' discriminatory law enforcement practices being directly addressed by the federal judge whose civil rights they had violated through systematic constitutional violations and racial profiling that demonstrated profound ignorance of proper police training and constitutional requirements. Your Honor, Thompson stammered with obvious shock and growing awareness of the magnitude of their constitutional mistakes and the professional identity of the individual whose civil rights they had systematically violated through discriminatory policing and racial profiling. We had no idea that you were a federal judge during our security investigation. Judge Monroe maintained her judicial composure and constitutional authority while addressing the systematic civil rights violations and educational opportunities that the situation presented for proper law enforcement training and constitutional compliance throughout the federal system and local police agencies that must respect individual civil rights, regardless of personal assumptions or institutional biases. This is why truth always comes to light, and justice always finds its way. If this story shows you that dignity and respect matter more than assumptions, make sure you subscribe to see more stories where justice prevails. Because when we stand together against discrimination, we make real change happen. Following the extraordinary federal courthouse encounter, an undeniable demonstration of how racial profiling and discriminatory law enforcement could violate the constitutional rights of any American citizen, including federal judges, Phoenix Sky Harbor Airport immediately initiated comprehensive reforms to security training programs, constitutional compliance procedures, and civil rights protection measures that would ensure proper law enforcement conduct and eliminate discriminatory policing practices that violated clearly established Fourth Amendment precedent and equal protection guarantees under federal constitutional law. Officers Thompson and Rodriguez were immediately suspended and required to complete extensive constitutional law training, civil rights education, and diversity programs that would address their discriminatory policing practices and provide comprehensive understanding of proper investigative procedures and constitutional requirements for reasonable suspicion and probable cause that must guide all law enforcement conduct, regardless of demographic characteristics or racial appearance of individuals encountered during security investigations. The incident became a landmark case in airport security reform and constitutional policing, as Judge Monroe's federal civil rights lawsuit resulted in significant financial settlements and industry-wide changes to law enforcement protocols that would prevent similar constitutional violations and ensure appropriate recognition of individual civil rights during security investigations, regardless of personal assumptions or racial profiling practices that had characterized previous discriminatory policing. Patricia's judicial involvement in the constitutional education process became a model for effective civil rights enforcement throughout the federal court system as documentation and analysis of her case spread across legal networks and judicial training programs, inspiring courts nationwide to increase their oversight of law enforcement conduct and ensure appropriate constitutional compliance during security investigations and criminal procedure that must balance legitimate safety concerns with individual civil rights protected by the Constitution. Within months of the courthouse encounter, Thompson and Rodriguez had completed comprehensive constitutional training and demonstrated improved understanding of proper investigative techniques and civil rights requirements, while Phoenix Sky Harbor Airport implemented new protocols requiring strict constitutional compliance and eliminated racial profiling practices that had characterized their previous security procedures and discriminatory law enforcement approaches. The transformation extended beyond individual airport policies to influence broader conversations about racial profiling in law enforcement, the importance of constitutional training for security personnel, and the critical need for judicial oversight that would ensure optimal constitutional compliance during security investigations that must balance legitimate safety concerns with individual civil rights protected by the Bill of Rights and constitutional amendments that form the foundation of American democracy and equal justice under law. But Judge Monroe's story is just one example of how constitutional justice always prevails in the end. Next video. Watch what happens when a black general counsel's 14-year secret is revealed during airline discrimination. When crew questions her legal authority, the most shocking corporate law credentials in aviation history emerge. You won't believe what happens when legal power meets institutional prejudice. If you enjoyed this video, please subscribe and turn on notifications for new content. Don't forget to hit the like button if this story moved you, and share your thoughts and opinions about this situation in the comments below.